Awesome. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us in the next installation of our AZA Safe Monarchs webinar series. This has been an amazing session. We've had a lot of people joining the seminars and also a lot of people watching the recordings afterwards. And it's all been topics that have been very popular and relevant to the folks that are working in zoos and aquariums and wanting to make a difference for monarch butterflies. This particular topic is one that is a tricky one, and I'm super excited to have a couple of experts that can speak to this topic, which is how to reduce your pesticide usage, how to be more pesticide free. It's one that I have struggled with, and I am very eager to learn more about it. We've got a couple of amazing speakers today. We've got Steve Foltz, the Director of Horticulture from the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden, and we have Joe Boggs, Assistant Professor with the Ohio State University.
No. You did it.
Threw it in there. That was just for you. Steve Foltz #2. So welcome, and I'm going to kick it off to them. We're going to do, as always, the seminar, and with the time left over, we'll have some facilitated discussion. If you have questions, please go ahead and enter it into the Q&A box below, and we'll address all of those questions at the end. Take it away, Steve and Joe.
Well, thanks a lot, Zach. And Steve and I have team taught different parts of this, but one thing we're going to be doing is kind of a little bit more of a conversational style, but how to be more pesticide free. Zach, I think, was very concerned about the length of this presentation, but we're going to just make a first and last point, that is to be pesticide free, just don't spray. And that's the end. Do we have any questions? Are we ready, Steve, for the end of questions? Or
that's about all that needed to be said.
Well, of course, being a little facetious there, but we all know that is sometimes just the response that we hear is just don't spray. Well, that can lead to a challenge. A first reality check for many of us is, what do you do about this non-native tree killer, emerald ash borer, that converts trees into this? When we know that ash provided a lot and still do environmental services. This isn't at a zoo or botanical garden. This is actually at a restaurant, and you can see this huge ash, and you can see the environmental service. It's the shade for this patio area where people eat. So what do you do there? Well, in my opinion, of course, I have to say I've been with OSU for Ohio State for 30 years. And in my time, I've watched the development of systemic insecticides. And of course, as we know, their connection to pollinators has then kind of made it perceived to be a bad thing. However, what's the alternative to systemics, which are inside the plant? Well, that's what people used to do. And if you did what we call topical applications, this happens to be on a hemlock for hemlock woolly adelgid, you're killing everything with topical applications, but that's what was done before the systemic. So the first reality check, sometimes you need to do something in the way of emerald ash borer to maintain large ash trees. One option is to use systemic insecticides. Environmentally, actually, I see them as a great improvement, although we're still learning some of the impacts. And here's the other reality check, high profile landscaping. Welcome to the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden. Steve, we have to change that. We call it the Cincinnati Botanical Garden and Zoo. At any rate, high profile, people come to not just then see the wonderful displays of animals and learn about zoology and learn all the things that we hope that they take home, relative to endangered species and work done by our zoological gardens to maintain species that otherwise might go extinct. We want them to learn that, but they often do visit to be able to see the botanical garden part and to enjoy it. And of course, thankfully, insects are included because they are animals after all. But what do you do when you have a beautiful elm looking like this? What do you do when you have caterpillars just cleaning up on a certain plant, or bagworms bagging different plants like these arborvitae, or fall webworm? Look at this and totally almost encasing this tree. Or you have woolly aphids that then produce honeydew. So They're literally, you know, pooping on people. Do you just say, well, don't spray? This is mimosa webworm, but it's on honey locusts. We have a lot of honey locusts up here, and there's a really bad thing they do. Once the caterpillars are about to pupate, they spin down on webs. Should we just put a sign up for everyone to say, please ignore the caterpillars that are dropping onto you? Well, sometimes science can be helpful. This is one of the largest wasps that we have in North America. It's a cicada killer wasp, and it is kind of scary. I mean, this is a female, her big stinger. The females are not at all aggressive. In fact, you almost have to work hard to get stung by one of these. The males, on the other hand, which since they don't have ovipositors, they don't have stingers, the males are very aggressive because they're looking for other males and they're trying to stake out a territory. But again, they don't have stingers. So the females are busy out there digging their burrows. The males are flying around harassing people. I shared before we came on, Steve and I were talking with Zach before we came on, that 2 parks here in greater Cincinnati, one in particular with the great parks of Cincinnati, they were, the high profile location was cicada killer wasps. Their complaints went to 0 once they did this. They put out signs. So sometimes signs telling people, and this was in another park, signs telling people exactly what's going on so they understand, can be very effective in terms of an educational outreach so that they're not uncomfortable with what's happening. But the bottom line is there's really a change that we want to make to this title, sustainability, because sustainable landscapes, the major goal is less inputs, the less the better, because otherwise that's not a sustainable landscape. We want it to be sustainable without inputs. And so an objective is to create less need for pesticides. So that's really what our talks are going to focus on, creating sustainable landscapes. It's not new. I only picked this particular paper out because Nina Bassick's been around for quite some time, Cornell, and she really led the way on a lot of things. This is a paper that I had back in 2010, Creating Urban Eden, Sustainable Landscape Establishment in Theory and Practice. This was a 2-semester course at Cornell, and one thing that they focus on was soil remediation. So we're going to kind of talk about that relative to sustainability. All that we did, all that we said or saying must come from contact with the soil. Yates. Isn't that so true? That's what we are all involved with, plants and growing plants from the soil up, because we look at these disasters. I know I Latinize some of these. Suburbia terra terribilis, backyard basement soil. So all this soil was in the basement. Now it's put out here on top of the ground. Planter scandals. These are planters, tree planters, annuals, perennials, everything. Look at the soil that's in that planter. And then we put in a little topsoil and have no drainage. Modern day glaciation, where we move soil around all over the place. And then sometimes the topsoil just gets sold and you're left with subsoil. Of course, we have Lepidopterus compressus. This is caterpillar damage. We can see the caterpillar tracks. Steve, I wish you hadn't put that in there. That's not very. But what's the impact of topsoil loss or compaction? Well, if we just look at nutrient availability, subsoil it's big chunks of things. You don't have clay, for example. I know a lot of people say boo on clay, except those clay particles actually have very high cation exchange capacity. It's a fancy way of saying they hold on to nutrients. The clay particles hold more nutrients than silt and sand. But in the subsoil, you have almost 0 CEC. And when we look at subsoil, surface subsoil, so the subsoil is at the surface, or compaction, it creates a physical barrier to root growth. I mean, look at this wonderful, this is in potting media, there's no barrier, but it's almost like when you plant out into that kind of situation, it's like you're planting into a pot. You're creating a physical barrier. And of course, water, limited infiltration, and then limited water drainage, which can lead to such things as Phytophthora root rot. There's a reason Phytophthora is in a group called water molds, because they do quite well when you have high soil moisture content. Of course, the #1 element required for root growth is oxygen. We like to see about 25% air, not just oxygen, of soil by volume. Once you hit 5%, roots stop growing. At 2%, they die, and that leads to plant stress. So let's talk a bit about stress, stressing stress. We've all felt this way, right? Stress can make plants more susceptible to pests and diseases, which equals then more needs for pesticide applications. Now, this isn't always true. Sometimes plants are just simply inherently susceptible, but I think we would all agree that stress can reduce a plant's ability to handle pests and diseases. It's often that stress initiates, for example, with bark beetles. Our native bark beetles do not go after healthy native trees. Despite what you may hear, it's just simply not true. So our crystal ball will tell us that stress can reduce the ability to handle pests, and that then leads to the possibility of more pesticide applications. But the bottom line is plant stress is an indirect plant killer. Usually the things that happen afterwards, like bark beetles, those are secondary. So if we want to reduce the need for pesticide applications, let's first start with keeping plants healthy so we don't need to make those applications. A little side note, Steve, when I go on a tangent, actually only Steve and I know if I'm on a tangent because you all don't know, but when we go on tangents, we have to pull each other back. But I will tell you this, it's very common, for example, in my line of work, for bark beetles to be attacking a tree, and then I get the picture and I get asked, what can I spray? Well, if the bark beetles are attacking a tree, it's too late to spray. They're attacking that tree because it's dropped its defenses. And that's why they're coming in. So the beetles are secondary. And so spraying is simply too late. Well, back again, healthy plants. And I'm going to turn this over to what I consider to be one of the, Steve and I were together yesterday, and I said, I think this is one of the best community outreach programs I've seen relative to horticulture. So Steve, take it away on the Rockdale Academy story.
Yeah, Joe, thanks. This is a school about 3 blocks from the zoo. It's a K-6 elementary school. And this was where the original school was, and they bulldozed it down and threw a little grass on top. And we came in with the addition of the Cincinnati Reds and Children's Hospital and several major organizations in the city. And we wanted to create an urban garden, not only for the school, but for the community as well. So when we first got there, you can see it's just basically pretty poor soil and very poor soil. In fact, you dug down, you found chunks of concrete and asphalt from the buildings. So, basically in March, there was nothing there. By August, when we completed the project with over 400 volunteers and many, many tandems of topsoil. In fact, we used 88 tandems of soil mix that had compost and nice amendments with it. And, by the first year, it was looking just phenomenal. And again, once you put the soil in, you're in good shape. But had we not done good soil, you can't fix it, because you can see there's fence around the property. There's no way you're going to be doing major improvements. So the big takeaway for me on this is, if you don't get your soil right in the beginning, you're going to be struggling from then on. So I know everyone wants to just, maybe throw a little compost in, but sometimes you just literally have to bring in soil and raised beds in certain situations, especially when you have, a lot of zoos and aquariums, especially zoos. It's very compact space to work in. And, there really isn't any soil left when you're building and removing and doing things like that. So adding soil is a major component to sometimes these difficult situations that we have to deal with in zoos and aquariums. So go ahead, Joe.
Well, a little short segue then, just perfect timing on that. this is a serious presentation, Zach. I hope you know. Building healthy plants. Now, this is taken back from a publication in 1999, but it actually predates that. It's just that the publication, an Introduction to Soil Health, I really like the graphic that they put together. And like I said, this is a modified, but it's only because of fitting the screen. So the idea, and this should not be new to anyone at all. This is a review. This should, everybody on here, okay, yeah, we know adding organic matter is important. But why? Well, first, it increases biological activity and diversity. You know, I'm going to get this all wrong 6 ways from Sunday in terms of my knowledge base, but I often compare the soil to the Serengeti Plain, right? I've never been there, but many of you have. And what do we really want to see in these large ecosystems, like these savanna ecosystems? We want to see diversity, right? Animal diversity, and then all the way down. But the point is that biological diversity leads to things that are very important. We forget sometimes that the rhizosphere root zone is an ecological area that affects plants directly. So increasing biological activity and diversity first leads to reduced soil-borne diseases. You might think, wait a second, he talked about Phytophthora a minute ago. That's a water mold. What's happening there? Well, it turns out a lot of the pathogens that we see in the soil don't compete well with other microorganisms. There are microorganisms, fungi, bacteria, that make a living on other microorganisms, including those that we would call pathogens. And so we see this. The science is very strong on this. Actually, the first study I was ever aware of was on Phytophthora, done at Ohio State back in the late 90s. And it was so clear, just adding organic matter to the soil reduce incidence of disease. Of course, that leads to healthy plants. What else? It decomposes and releases humus and other growth promoting substances, as well as detoxifies the soil. You know, it's hard to imagine, but many of the things we call toxins, including pesticides, believe it or not, are viewed by many microorganisms as simply a carbon source, nothing more, nothing less. It doesn't kill them. They see it as a food. And so by increasing diversity, we can reduce a lot of the hydrocarbons, for example, in soil that otherwise we would consider to be contaminated soil. Also, decomposition releases nutrients and enhance plant health, but it also then leads to aggregation. We're going to get to more about that, because aggregation is directly connected to something we call tilth. And this has to do with improved soil structure. And of course, repeat. So let's talk about this aggregation. You know, this study was done quite some time ago. And this is actually Ohio forest soil. 1 cup, 50,000 arthropods, 100,000 nematodes, 20 million protozoa, 60 miles of fungal hyphae. Now, we call these the squirmies sometimes. And what do? They provide a very good benefit. I'm not going to take time on that, but a very good benefit, because if we look at soil particles, sand, silt, clay with a little humus in there, we have these very narrow micropores, which really even water can't easily get through. But then we add the squirmies. And just as the animals in our zoos, they release material, they release waste that glues together, goes on the surface of these particles, it glues them together. And I'm not making this term up. This is a scientific term. It's called microbial glue. Now, what that then leads to, it sticks these particles together and leads to something called a PED. That's the soil term, but a soil aggregate. So just picture this in your mind. These are all kind of stuck together, easily broken apart, stuck together. But if you have a lot of these, now what you have are aggregates, and then a very important void called macropores. The micropores are still in there, and that's important relative to nutrient movement and sticking to the surface of clay, for example. But macropores, good structure. You can see it with your own eyes. This is a very good agricultural soil in eastern Ohio. The only thing is on one of our OSU farms, and the only difference is a farm road. A farm road split this field. And so they didn't till for 43 years, but then started tilling 5 years before this shot was taken. And you can see the difference. Do you see the aggregation? And look over here, just totally collapsed. I mean, you can even see it in the color. So I'm going to tell you something that people will just doubt, except you can see it with your own eyes if you go into areas with heavy clay soils and go in the forest. Sand versus clay, which drains faster? I'm telling you that we can make clay drain as fast as sand through soil, through aggregation. So we have these aggregated clay particles. What's in between? Macropores, the water flows through. But it's even better because those clay particles hold more water. They have higher surface to volume ratio. They also attract because they're negatively charged. They hold on to the positive end of water molecules. So you get water stuck to the clay. So you have high nutrient load in here, and you also have good drainage, and you have moist, well-drained soils. What more can you ask for? This is better soil than sand. And if you don't believe us, go to the woods. That's what I always tell people. You know, this is a shot of a forest in eastern Ohio, and there's a nice little, that's not a stream, that's actually a spring coming out. Anything up to probably 4 to 5 inches per hour, and you're not going to see any runoff. Why? Because that soil is aggregated. The water moves into the soil, eventually filters down to things like springs. That's soil aggregation. Nature does it for us. So it's natural. As Francis Bacon said, nature is often hidden, sometimes overcome, but seldom extinguished. And then Horace, Naturam expellis furca est recurrent. I just butchered all my Latin from high school. Translation, you can drive nature out with a pitchfork, but she always comes back. Aggregation is going to occur whether we want it to or not, but we can help it along. But this brings up another point of debate often. Yes, a rototiller improves consistency. It lofts the soil. Yes, it does destroy soil structure. However, it is the ideal machine for fixing compaction. If you have caterpillar damage like this and you need to get things started, rototilling can very much help. And then also mixing organic matter into that soil. And finally, usage, short-term improvements like annual beds, and even long-term improvements by mixing organic matter into the soil. So a rototiller is a very helpful piece of machinery for helping to jumpstart things. But let's switch gears now and let's just go to the pest management decisions that can either enhance or reduce the need for pesticides. And we're going to start with plant selection. First, there is no such thing as plants with no pests. Plants are living organisms. They're going to have things that are going to come and attack them. Well, there are some plants like plastic flowers and plastic trees, and not really sure what's happening there. But nonetheless, there's no such thing as a plant with no pests. So the next best thing is choose plants that are less susceptible to pests. We all love azaleas, but so does azalea lacebug. And of course, there's the little lacebug, named for the lacy look to the wings, sucks away the juices of individual cells in the leaves. Hawthorn lacebug on cotoneaster can make cotoneaster look very bad, but let's talk about hawthorns. Look what it does on hawthorns. Hawthorn leaf miner sawfly, hawthorn pod gulls, cedar quince rust on hawthorn that can lead to Cheeto fingers. Choose plants that are less susceptible to pests. Now, I actually do like hawthorns. If any of you are using them, don't say, well, yeah, you just blasted hawthorns. Just be aware, it is a plant that can have quite a few pest problems. And so be aware of that. But plant selection does not affect generalists. Bagworms, 130 different species. There's the caterpillar that lives in that bag. And we tend to think of them as being on conifers only. However, they will attack a lot of deciduous plants, hornbeam, roses, Japanese beetles. That's another generalist. We tend to think of them on grape only. But of course, they love plants in the Asteraceae family. And this is impatiens, even milkweed. And what's wrong with this picture? Well, Japanese beetle traps are very effective. They can have a floral scent. They can also have that combined with a pheromone, a sex attractant. So The males think they're coming in to find females. And they are very effective. So let's hang one under one of the favorite foods of Japanese beetle, a linden tree. That's what's wrong with this picture. But even more wrong, research has clearly shown that these are so effective, you'll get many more Japanese beetles into the location than would otherwise be there. We joke about this, and I don't really recommend that people do this. We tell people, jokingly, give one of these to your neighbor. So it'll pull all the Japanese beetles out of your own landscaping. But that's kind of the idea. It's not a good pest management decision. And then this is the hardest thing to do with public gardens. We can do it for ourselves, and we recommend that we all work on this. Signs may be helpful, but raise your pest action threshold. Don't think of plant aesthetics, think of plant health. You should only react when whatever's happening has a direct impact on the overall health of the plant. This is Aesculus. It's actually a horse chestnut. That's Japanese beetle damage. Looks bad. It was done in July. Even that didn't hurt this tree at all. Now, that's hard to fathom. You might say, well, it looks bad. Again, don't go by looks. If it doesn't affect the health of the plant, it's not worth doing anything about. Steve and I have been watching this bladder nut slug sawfly, which actually, because of this happening at the zoo, this species was eventually found to be, positively identified, found to be a different species than what we thought it was, but also it helped entomologists to expand the host range for this particular species. So science kind of came into play here. But we've watched this for years, haven't we, Steve? And does it wipe out your bladder nut?
No, not at all. Just makes it look a little funny for a while, but I think that's the key point here. There are going to be plants that are going to get attacked by insects, but if they're not really hurting the plant, you don't really have to worry about that. And I know that's hard for people to hang on to, but bottom line is no reason to spray.
I love sumac, and of course I love galls. I have to tell you, I'm a gall maniac. This is an aphid gall, and they can be very weird looking things on sumac. Kind of look very alien, right? But does it cause any harm to the plant? None whatsoever. No harm whatsoever. And of course, we love to put out, I do. I mean, one of my favorite plants, goldenrod, attracts a lot of pollinators, but there are things that are attracted to goldenrod, like this midgefly gall. Doesn't hurt the plant. Neither does this gall. Another midgefly gall does not hurt the plant. Makes it look kind of strange, but doesn't hurt the plant. Again, it doesn't hurt the health of the plant. Whoops, Steve, so raise your pest action threshold, think impact. Oh, Steve, this is where Steve and I were working on this before. This is a review, right, Steve?
Oh, review away.
Yeah, review away. So next on pest management decisions, identify, monitor, and this I love. Steve, you came up with this. I'm going to only kill what needs killing. That is extremely important. If we take a look, for example, one of my favorite plants, I love coneflowers of all sorts. Of course, so do pollinators and all kinds of different coneflowers and pollinators. It's a great pollinator plant. Well, then along comes another midgefly that creates this prairie coneflower gall. And you can see there's the gall maker right there. It's not hurting the plant, but it makes it look pretty bad. What's happening with these coneflowers? Well, this is a coneflower rosette mite, which is an areophyte, a very, very tiny little mite. It doesn't have a scientific name yet, but nonetheless, we call it rosette because it makes the cones look like going into a rosette stage. Here we have it on a purple coneflower, normal rosette. And now if you look at this little dusty area, what these areophytes do is when temperatures rise and wind starts moving, they actually climb up to the tips here so they can hitchhike on birds or even be blown by the wind. And there's a little close up. Very weird looking things. They're cigar shaped. But what's a management option for this that doesn't involve a pesticide approach? Well, clip heads and destroy them. If I cut these heads off and destroy them, try to keep from knocking any off, you can eliminate these out of a planting. No pesticides needed. But what's happening here? Well, there is the coneflower rosette mite, and this is a little different. You can see it is a little different. This is aster yellows, which is a type of very small bacterium called a phytoplasma. And so this is a phytoplasma disease specific to Asteraceae. Not many, though. I don't want to go across all in the family, but nonetheless, makes the flowers look really funky. Look at this. Just, it's like something from outer space, doesn't it? And you can clearly see this, and those plants are never going to amount to anything. They'll always be stunted. They'll always produce these weird flowers. Worse, this phytoplasma is spread by sucking insects. So if you have a tree hopper or a plant hopper that feeds on this plant and then goes to these plants, it will vector the phytoplasma. The phytoplasma cannot live outside the plant, though, and that's good news. Because if you have a little plant, if you have a plant like this, the management is to dig it up and destroy the infected plant. It will not live in the soil, so you don't need to worry about the soil, but it will live in the roots. So get all the plant removed. And by the way, this planting is at a local park, county park. And unfortunate for me, because I like to take pictures, they pretty well eliminated aster yellows. And that was that big planting I showed you at the very beginning. So just without pesticides, without any application of anything, they've taken that out. Potato leaf hopper on wafer ash. Only an aesthetic issue, right, Steve?
It's aesthetic, and I don't know that I've ever seen a wafer ash in the middle of the summer that didn't have it.
It's true. It's true. It just, but well, look at this. Oh my gosh. Look at this big caterpillar, the orange dog. Don't you love that name? Orange dog caterpillar. Now it's causing a lot of damage, isn't it, Steve? I mean, look at this. It's feeding on the leaf. The leaf is already damaged by the potato leaf hoppers. Now this comes along. Well, should we spray? Well, no, not if we want that caterpillar to grow up to become a giant swallowtail, because that's what it becomes. Well, surely on pipe vine, look at this caterpillar just eating up our pipe vine. Should we spray? Only kill what needs killing. Not if we want to have pipe vine swallowtails, right, Steve? I mean, you have plantings at the zoo just so you can have the swallowtail butterflies.
You can always plant more pipe vine.
And it really doesn't hurt it much, does it? I mean, it just grows back.
No.
Beautiful. Yeah, beautiful butterfly. And it, will show up all over the place. All right, I know we're talking about monarchs, and I'm going to slant into this because I often get asked. We have these other caterpillars, and they're eating all my they're eating which one of the milkweeds most often, Steve? I should know that. That's what I'm pausing for, but
it's one of the Asclepias, probably Syriacus or.
Mm-hmm. So this is a milkweed tussock moth caterpillar. Now, folks, it has just as much right to the milkweed as monarchs. It's really a beautiful caterpillar. Yes, it does start feeding as very young caterpillars and does create damage, and it will remove some leaves, occasionally an entire plant. However, it does not cause enough harm to warrant even trying to manage them. And I once again contend it's just part of the milkweed menagerie. It's part of the ecosystem. Here we have, what we would love to see, monarchs, right? And the caterpillars, we want the food to be good for the caterpillars. Then along comes oleander aphid, a non-native to boot. Just covers the plant, makes it look horrid, and sometimes even stunts it. Well, should we spray? Well, of course, you wouldn't want to use an insecticide, but insecticidal soap will kill these. What's everybody think? I wish we were live so I could see a show of hands. Well, sometimes things are not clear relative to pest impacts. Asymmetry of plant-mediated interactions between specialist aphids and caterpillars on 2 milkweeds, 2014. Very interesting paper. So this is the scientific name, as we all know, for monarchs. Larvae feeding on plants together with, this is a scientific name for the aphid, weighed almost 38% more compared to larvae on control plants without aphids. I'm letting that sink in. So with aphids, the caterpillars were bigger. They were consuming more food. Now, they weren't feeding. What this is saying is that The presence of aphids did not influence the amount of leaf damage, and so it was not impacted by the present. The increased weight was not simply due to greater feeding, it was due to greater quality of the food. Monarch caterpillars, we often teach, are resistant to the alkaloid toxins in their favored hosts. That's not true. They are tolerant of the alkaloid toxins. There's a little bit of harm, it's just that they can tolerate it. However, once these aphids come along and pull down the toxic dosage, it creates better food for the caterpillar. Counterintuitive, isn't it, folks? It's counterintuitive, but it's true. You've got to follow the science. So we're going to switch gears quite a lot and go into pest management decisions by connecting some dots. And quite frankly, I believe this will help you the most on many levels. So here's Steve, and here's a group at the Cincinnati. Oh, wait a second. I have that wrong. It's not it's the Cincinnati Botanical Garden and Zoo. And so until COVID came along, kind of interrupted things, we would do monthly diagnostic walkabouts. I've been doing these for about 23 years with tree care professionals and others. So here we are with Steve leading the group. Steve, I'm somewhere in the back because why am I in the back? Somewhere just kind of.
You're always aimlessly walking in the back looking for insects.
That's exactly right. And continually frustrated at the zoo because there are very few pests. Now, how much do you all spray there, Steve?
Well, we do not spray our plants at the zoo at all.
At all. I mean, think about this. Not a single. And yet I'm looking around. I make a living looking for pests, plant pests. And I go there and, in fact, it's actually ruined me, hasn't it, Steve? Because now I've learned I must learn to appreciate plants and forget about the pests. It's been horrible for me. But nonetheless, as a matter of fact, I'm not making it up. Hard to find pests there. Now, I should have known the reason. This is one of those things where very often we learn things in our life that we already knew, we just hadn't connected the dots. So for example, when I show you this picture, what comes to mind? It's a mass planting display. Is this a pollinator garden? Is this a naturalized area? Well, actually, we should call these a pest management garden, because the connecting the dots is flower power equals natural enemies. That's the connection of the dots. And this is going to be a recurring theme, starting with another segue with pivotal research that I already knew about, but Steve and I talked about this. It took me a while to arrive at this, didn't it, Steve? Why do we not have pests at the zoo, plant pests at the zoo? So the overarching title of this research is Disasters by Design. And here are the papers if you want to. Of course, this is being recorded, so you could go back and look these up starting in 2006. And here are the rock star scientists. Mike Raup at University of Maryland, just retired. His wife, Paula Shrewsbury, still at the University of Maryland. And Dan Herms used to be our department chair at OSU. He's now with Davy Tree. And I consider these three publications to be cornerstones to help us with connecting the dots. In particular, let's look at this disasters by design, outbreaks along urban gradients. And what do we mean by urban gradients? Well, in our case, we start with an eastern deciduous forest with a lot of diversity. Then, as this quote that I love always using, suburbia is where the developer bulldozes out the trees and then names the streets after them. I used to laugh at that all the time until this happened about 10 miles from my house. So this is about 10 miles. There's the bulldozing out of the trees. There are the trees. There's where the bulldozer was. Look what they named the street, Woodview Way. I keep wanting to go out and just add on to that. No, Woodview went away. So we start with heavy diversity, and then we start whittling it back. These two trees and that tree back there, they were originally part of this forested area until the parking lot went in. This tree was left there so it would shade the cars until it finally dies and falls on them. And you can see why it's going to die is because it has no root area. Steve, I can't believe you put that joke in there. And we've all seen this. Then we have our developments. And again, monoculture by a natural selection. We just have very few trees. This is a hospital complex, 30 acres with only 5 plant species. So what have we done? We went from an eastern deciduous forest down to 5 plant species in 30 acres. So here's research that Mike and Paula did, where they took a look at 212 landscapes in Maryland, and they divided those into 2 groups. One group with low diversity with an average of about 3 species, and the other group with high diversity with about 38 species. And then they took a look at some things. They took a look, for example, at generalist predators. These are things that eat arthropods that eat other arthropods, including insects. Now, a little bit on statistics. When you see a number right here, and this number plus and minus, you need to add this number to that number, and then go over here and subtract this number from that number. And if those 2 numbers overlap, they are not statistically different. So that's just a little statistics. I think I don't need to add and subtract to see that these are different between simple and complex. Same with the spiders and with the pests, a big difference. And then Paula, actually, this is some of her research. She went a little further. Remember the azalea lace bug? Well, she took a look at azalea lace bug, and what she found was number of lace bugs in the simple landscape. Remember, only 3, the diversity of 3. Now, another statistical rule, see this bar right here? If what I'm going to show you when I go to diverse, if that bar overlaps the size of what's going to rise up here, they're not statistically different. I think they're statistically different. I don't think, as a matter of fact, I have to tell a little story on myself. I actually, when I used the data, but this was so small, you couldn't even see it. I actually kind of had to cheat. So I added some numbers a little bit just so it'd rise enough so you can see there actually is a bar there. Look at the difference, number of lace bugs between simple and complex. Science is mind-blowing. It truly is. Further flower power on this, the number of natural enemies again. And what Paula and Mike looked at was with azaleas only. It says no flowers, but azaleas have flowers. Just okay, that's it. And so 4 different dates, they looked at the number of natural enemies. And there's the graphs. But then they added 1 flowering plant, coriander. What just happened to the number of natural enemies? In each case, they went up. Then they added another, Shasta daisy, just 2 flowering plants. What just happened with the number of natural enemies? Why do you think I cannot find pests at the Cincinnati Botanical Garden and Zoo? Well, if we take a look at what's actually happening here, a parasitoid wasp and catalpa hornworm. A catalpa hornworm goes after its native host, but a wasp, a parasitoid wasp, called Contagia congregata, doesn't have a common name, will come in and the females will lay eggs on the wasp. Those immature wasp larvae will clean everything out, not kill the caterpillar right away, and eventually develop into pupae. Before they pupate, the larvae come to the surface and spin these cocoons. And here's another very important factor. Every one of these cocoons is going to give rise to a female. This species has no males. It's called reproduction by parthenogenesis. They don't have to be mated. So every one of these cocoons will create a new wasp to go off and do the same thing to the caterpillars. And yes, the caterpillar is still alive, but I've taken a lot of the cocoons off just to show you the caterpillar. And this is the same caterpillar just about 2 hours later. They eventually did, of course, kill the caterpillar. So what am I leading up to? Well, in connecting the dots with flower power equals natural enemies, there are the wasps. Actually, just a little bit of a sad story I'll share with you. Okay, yes, they're all dead because entomologists have learned that if you're trying to take pictures of insects, it's good to slow them down when they're buzzing around. And a good way to slow them down is put them in a refrigerator. Well, I did, it turned out that they had a low temperature threshold. So these are permanently still, they're dead. It's sad, but nonetheless, that's what they look like. But we know what the larvae eat. They eat the caterpillars, but what do the female wasps eat? They have to have nectar. All these flowering plants, every parasitoid wasp adult needs to have nectar in order to have energy to go and spread their joy. Brown marmorated stink bugs, those of you on the East Coast, you dealt with these, you know that they're really quite a nuisance pest. They can also damage fruit and vegetables. But as we saw at the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden, along comes this little stink bug hunter wasp. It digs its burrows in sandy soil. There was a sandy area at the zoo. But why it was there is because the zoo has a lot of flowering plants. It provisions its burrows with nymphs of stink bugs. So it goes after things like brown marmorated stink bugs. What do the female wasps eat? Nectar. And so if you provide nectar, you will automatically be supporting an enemy of brown marmorated stink bugs. Same for this little fly, the feather-legged fly, called that because it has these nice little feathery structures on there. It's a parasitoid of true bugs. Once again, brown marmorated stink bugs. What do the adult flies eat? Nectar. By the way, a little side note, Diptera flies are the second most important order in the world for plant pollinators. Most people would automatically think it's Lepidoptera. Well, the most important order is Hymenoptera, bees, wasps, yes. The second most important is Diptera, flies. The third most important are Lepidoptera. The fourth most important are Coleoptera, the beetles. So that's a little known factoid to keep in mind. Flies can be very important relative to pest management. And then we have these predators, and here's another fly. And we can tell it's a fly because DI2, PTRA means wings. They just have two wings. These are hover or syrphid flies. Their maggots are meat eaters. They hunt down aphids. But I think you can clearly see what the adults are after. This is a very common fly coming into roses of all kinds. Of course, this is a native rose, but also knockout roses, as long as the flower is fully open. I very commonly find syrphid flies on knockouts. But hybrid teas kind of teach us a cautionary tale. I love hybrid teas. I'm not saying don't plant hybrid teas, but I am telling you that if through horticultural selection for interest, the flowers are closed, then the syrphid flies can't get into the flower. So this is the cautionary tale. They weren't bred for nectar flow. Now, I mentioned that Diptera is the second most important order for pollinating insects, and flies really do like hydrangea. And contrary to popular belief, another bit of information that's not entirely correct is that plants that are pollinated by flies stink. Well, some plants do, but the vast majority don't. I mean, hydrangeas, I've never noticed them stinking. Sometimes they can have a little off scent, but not bad. But here's a situation with unintended consequences. When this was bred, this hydrangea was bred for horticultural interest, but inadvertently, they also somehow included or amplified the genetic profile that would attract more flies. Now, it sounds like a joke, and it kind of is funny because, I mean, you wouldn't want to sell this or have this in your landscape. But what it tells us is that a pollinator attractiveness is a genetic trait. And so we could selectively breed plants to enhance this attractive, but maybe this is a step too far because flies have friends and family plan. Steve, I see we're running low on time, aren't we? And I'm getting a little carried away. What do you think?
Yeah.
Skip ahead a bit.
Skip ahead a bit. We'll finish up.
So I'm going to stop sharing, everyone, just for a minute. I'll come back in a second. I just want to, I don't want to keep everybody. You get the flavor, though, of what we're trying to say. And what we're trying to say is that by including more flowers, you can then enhance the attractiveness of enemies of other insects to your landscape, which means that you're going to reduce the need for pesticide applications, specifically the need for insecticide applications. So we're going to finish though with a case study. And this, Zach, I know we're going a little bit over, but if I can have we can have a few more minutes, because this really does bring home the main point we're trying to make here. It's the final segue. Steve, am I still alive, or did I cut myself off?
No, I can see you. You're good.
Okay. So connect the dots, putting it together. We're going to actually focus on one insect that I've already mentioned, the common bagworm. That's not bagworm. Some people call these bagworms, eastern tint, fall webworm. That's only because the silk nest makes, kind of looks like a bag, but those aren't bagworms. Again, you already saw this. Here's a bagworm. There's a caterpillar inside a silk sock that's festooned with the pieces of the host. And again, that's the caterpillar. I've often thought, I guess if I looked like that, I'd probably live in a bag too. Maybe I should. But at any rate, bagworms are very common in the South, more common in the South than anywhere else. And as a matter of fact, they used to be called evergreen bagworms, still are called that, because they do like to go on evergreens. However, in the last 20 years, they have gradually marched north. When I first started the extension in Ohio, we seldom saw them past about mid-Ohio. We used to say above Interstate 70, you just didn't see them. So that unnamed state up north, Michigan, they just didn't exist to speak of, but now they do. Steve and I think it's a good example of global warming. That's bad, isn't it, Steve?
Here's where you need the live audience, Joe.
I do need the live audience. So we're going to use integrated pest management, which has been around since 1967, to talk about managing bagworm with a reduced dependence on pesticide applications. Of course, with IPM, it is important to remember that insecticide applications are part of it, but they should be held back. Do these other things first, and don't use this tactic if it's going to interfere with these tactics. So very quickly, we could spray for bagworms, but we say that it's problematic for two reasons. One is that bagworms have asynchronous development. We'll get that in a second. And early instars, the young bagworms, are the most susceptible. So here's a shot of a collection of bagworms I took the same day, pulled these off. They're all live. These kept trying to crawl away. Same plant, same day, and look at the range. This is asynchronous development. And it means that if you sprayed, well, these would be killed. These would likely not be killed because they're too big. So what does that tell you? Well, all right, insecticides aren't the best approach, but let's talk about other approaches. Culturally, we call this direct approach, for example. In the winter, female bagworms look like this. They're dead inside the bag. The females never develop into a moth and leave the bag. They get mated by the males, which do have wings, that come in and mate with them. But then the female ovaries start producing eggs and just fills the body with eggs. So this is what they look like in the winter. So we can rely on that to go digital, do the digital IPM tool. That's just what you're looking at right here. So we're plucking bagworms off of a plant, off of a juniper. There's a handful of bagworms put in a bag. We call it bago bagworms. And then Steve and I are going to demonstrate the two-step bagworm control method. The first step is put them on a hard surface. Now, these bags actually don't have eggs in them. These have caterpillars. So I did this on my own juniper to demonstrate this. And in case there are any little kids or anything, we're going to have to give you a warning. Viewer discretion on this because of violence. Because we'll give a couple of minutes, right, Steve? Take the kids away. Because the next step is this: you step on them, and there's no coming back from this. And so far, no population has ever become resistant to this. And that's the last thing they ever saw. It's true. You can have a little fun with that. It is highly effective, believe it or not, if you can get to the bags. But then we can also rely on help from our little friends, going all the way back to connect the dots. What happened here? This is the Christmas tree plantation I was called out for. And what was happening was the owner said he had a real bagworm problem. We could find no active bags because the bald-faced hornets had come in here and used their very powerful mandibles to rip open the bag and pull out the caterpillars. It's in part of this presentation. I had to skip it because of time. Bald-faced hornets, paper wasps, and yellow jackets feed their young meat. They are predators throughout much of their lifetime. So bald-faced hornets alone can be very helpful as a biological control agent. And by the way, it's a twofer. Once again, bald-faced hornets will visit flowers to get energy through nectar. A little more flower power. What you're looking at is a hole created at the tip of this bag by a parasitoid wasp. It's the emergence hole. Here's another one, and there's the wasp. She was inside. She had developed her larvae. The larvae had developed and killed this bagworm caterpillar. And there's the wasp. I pulled her out, and she's puffing her wings up, and there's her ovipositor, Idoplectus conquistator. 1976, factors affecting survival, larval and pupal stages of the bagworm. Idoplectus conquistator accounted for most, about 76% of the parasitism in this research study. 2005, conservation biological control in urban landscapes, manipulating parasitoids of bagworm. Parasitism rates of bagworm are 71% higher in shrubs that are surrounded by flowering forbs than in shrubs that lack flowers. It gets even better. In a third experiment, parasitism rates exceeded 70% in shrubs adjacent to central flowering beds of forbs, but less than 40% in shrubs that were further away. What are we saying? We are saying simply having flowering plants, all the way back to the research presented earlier by Mike and Paula. All we have to do is plant flowering plants. Science is pretty cool, isn't it? So the bottom line, flower power equals natural enemies. If you have a lot of diversity of flowering plants like we have here at the zoo, this is why I can't find bagworms. I can't find yellowneck caterpillars. I've never seen a red-headed pine sawfly at the zoo. And don't forget about trees. There's Steve, who will speak for the trees. Well, Steve and I are both tree huggers. I mean, there I am hiding behind a big leaf magnolia. That's a better shot. So here's a final study I want to highlight, that we want to highlight. 2022, woody plant diversity explains arthropod pest management interventions in residential landscaping. There's Mike, look at that, from Maryland. Mary Gardner, our own from Ohio State, as well as Chris, who was at Ohio State. And here's what they found. We found that the number of pest management interventions targeting, sorry, I about dropped something, Phytophagous arthropods, these are phytophagous, these are arthropods that eat other arthropods, or insects that eat other insects, was negatively related to woody plant diversity. Now, that negatively related might be hard to kind of sort through, so Steve and I created this very simple. This isn't taken from their data, it's just showing what does it mean negatively related. Well, as you increase woody diversity, the pest management interventions having to come in and do something about a pest decreased. That's pretty powerful. And so what they're saying is increase woody plant diversity, increase Phytophagous arthropod pest suppression, thereby reducing the need for pesticide applications. And here's something else in their study. The percentage of native plants on the property had no relationship with the number of pest management interventions. So we love seeing people using native plants, obviously. It enhances the palette in landscape design. But if you think you're doing it so that you can have greater environmental impact, and we're speaking with broad brush here, this study showed, well, you know, the non-natives also provided very good pest management services. And so don't forget about trees and shrubs. Buttonbush, one of our favorites, look at that. Who knew? Spirea, attracting syrphid flies, fragrant sumac, and also in the back's another really good one, red. We have here's the fragrant viburnum, eastern redbud. I mean, just a slurry of flowering trees that we can use. Can eat the fruit of serviceberry, linden, Don't forget about early flowering maples like red maple and silver maple and even, or sugar maple and even silver maple, providing that early nectar flow. Bottlebrush buckeye, since we're in Ohio, we have to talk about Aeschylus. There's Ohio buckeye, Aeschylus glabra, and of course the Ohio State buckeye, Aesculunius netosa. Now that's what I look like. Well, time flies like an arrow, but fruit flies like a banana. That's our last saying here. And so just a few final points very quickly. Now what comes to mind when you see these big collections of flowering plants? These aren't just pollinator gardens, they're also pest management gardens. Connect the dots. Flower power equals natural enemies. It's an ecological approach to plant pest management. That's our main point here. It's all about increasing flowering plant diversity, and we're not presenting a recipe. You decide what you would like to see. There is no recipe for this. So just a couple of overview. Don't forget starting healthy plants from the soil up, the value of adding that organic matter. Don't forget about the aggregation of the soil that's going to occur whether we want it to or not. We do want it to occur. And with pest management decisions, choose plants that are less susceptible. I had to ask Steve this because occasionally you see a little feeding damage. You can see a little bit down here on the edge of this, but bottlebrush buckeye or buttonbush, gee whiz, Steve. Buttonbush, witch hazel, native honeysuckle, allium, zinnia. Yeah, you might get a little powdery mildew, but that's being selected out. The point being is these plants and a lot of others are less susceptible to pests, but they do draw in enemies of other pests. Our major point, the true voyage of discovery, lies not in finding new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And that's the end of the program. But before we take questions, we want you to write this down. Put this in your planner. October 10th and 12th, Athens, Georgia. Protecting pollinators in urban landscapes. We're going to keep this up while we're answering questions. Protectingpollinators.org and all that. Write that down. Registration will be happening soon. 20 invited speakers. Steve and I will be there. Poster session, BID workshop, B-City workshop, and a lot more. Well, that brings us to the end, Zach, and I'm sorry, we're 5 minutes over the hour, so we probably lost about 99%, right?
We only lost 2. I think that you guys are engaging enough that people have stuck around, which is fantastic. I cannot thank you enough. This has been just marvelous. It's packed with incredible information, and I know everybody is wanting more. So I'm so glad that you are going to leave this slide up. For those of you that are able, attending the Protecting Pollinators in Urban Landscapes conference sounds like a must. Yeah, it sounds fantastic. Let's take a few minutes. There have been some questions coming through. Since we're already over and this thing lives on, we'll put it up onto YouTube. I think it's worth addressing some of the questions that have come up. Let's start with Jen from Brandywine Zoo's question. How do us non-horticulturists know if the pest is negatively affecting the health of the plant? If we shouldn't go by look. And I had a similar question, so I'll just throw mine in there at the same time, which is that with so many different species of plants and every species of plant potentially having multiple pests, how do we not, if we're trying to increase our pest action threshold, how do we not get ourselves into trouble, right? So those of us that are not horticulturists, what should our guidelines be? And if we're trying to increase our threshold, how do we do it without getting in over our heads?
One of the comments that I would make on that, Zach, is if a plant is going to get that attacked to the point where it's going to die, yeah, move on from that plant. Let that plant die. Then you've learned, and then, don't keep pounding that same plant and trying to make it work. For instance, we have a beautiful conical plant, the dwarf Alberta spruce in Cincinnati. And boy, if you want to see spider mite or spruce mite, just plant dwarf Alberta spruce. I mean, it's going to get it every year. So you won't find a dwarf Alberta spruce at the zoo because I know that it's going to get that problem. So I stay away from it. But if an insect gets to the point where it kills the plant, just stop using that. 2,000 other varieties you can plant. And I know it sounds simple, but that, a lot of times the insects just eat the leaves, but next year you find out that it leafed out fine and did fine again. So, yeah, just watching the plants or year after year is the way to go on that one, I think.
Yeah, I have to agree with that, and wholeheartedly, because we've watched that at the zoo. The bladder nut, for example, and the wafer ash. We've watched those. Those are the few things. Those are the reason I'm highlighting them is because they're about all I can find, right, Steve? I mean, I go to this place and say, "Oh, at least I found these."
What?
But they're but
I personally. Go ahead, Joe. I'm sorry.
Well, but they haven't done any real damage to the health. So I have to agree with Steve saying just watch what happens. But I want to say something else to everybody on here. And I'm not, I don't want to embarrass Steve here, but I am. And the fact is, 30 years with Extension, a high point of my career. I'm not, folks, I'm not overstating. This isn't hyperbole. This is a fact. A high point in my career was meeting Steve and getting to work with Steve at the zoo. And then you can see this partnership, and I consider it to be one of the most important things and the most satisfying, and let's face it, the most fun thing that I've ever done with Extension. So I would urge that you reach out. You could start with Extension. Maybe your county extension educator or agent isn't, but sometimes they are. Start there, work your way into the universities, find people. If you're in Maryland, for example, find Mike Raup. I mean, he is just a fireball. University of Florida, right? Zach, I mean, my goodness, you have some fantastic entomologists there. And you have a lot of people doing what I do. As a matter of fact, I say the shoulders of giants that I'm standing on, you already saw. And so I would urge that if you're struggling, if you're saying, I'm not sure about this, reach out and develop a relationship. They will be happy. I can tell you, when it comes to our land grants and other universities, being asked to work, with these locations, it's an honor for everybody. I can tell you that. As an educator, I love this, but I cannot stress that enough. Build partnerships with people that can help guide you. Is that insect pest really a pest? And who knows, also that person may learn along with you. Did I embarrass you enough, Steve, or is that
I think you're right on, Joe, and that's one of the beauties of, again, having Joe as a resource at our zoo. It made me aware of all the insects that we had and which ones we really should worry about, like emerald ash borer, and ones that we shouldn't. But like the wafer ash, I personally just do not like wafer ash in the garden because it looks so bad all the time. On the other hand, I sure like seeing the giant swallowtail.
Yeah.
And you just have to realize, well, maybe I'd put that wafer ash a little back further in the bed so no one really notices how bad it looks up close. So where you put things, how you plant. One thing that we didn't mention is we don't do a whole lot of very formal, organized plantings, and that's by design. If we do lose a plant, more than likely a good horticulturist can tell when it's going to die before the director of the zoo walks by, and they can get it out before he even sees it. But if you plant naturalistically, then it's a lot more forgiving in the long run. Now, I know that's not the case for everybody, but that does really help your decision-making process.
Well, and then finally, I know this, I kind of presented it when we were talking beforehand with Zach, almost kind of as a joke, but the sign idea, education is your best friend. I mean, let's face it, at the end of the day, that's what we are all doing, right? I mean, I realize, yes, okay, a lot of entertainment and so on and so forth, but we do hope that people are learning when they visit these different sites. And so putting a sign out so is exactly what's going on, and crafting the sign to say, oh, okay, this tree is, here's what's happening here, so that people know that, first of all, but secondly, there is a plan. The wafer ash is a perfect example. I did put that caterpillar. I mean, the orange dog caterpillar sounds awful, but there are people, as you very well know, that wouldn't know that caterpillar and see it feeding on that and thinking, oh, this is a pest, I got to spray, not recognizing they're doing in one of our favorite, the largest swallowtail butterfly in North America. And so putting signs out can be a very, very helpful thing. Now, no one's going to ask another question, Zach, because each question is going to take about 20 minutes.
Let's do one more last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Cassandra would like to know, their organization is planning on replanting a wild location versus an on-stage ornamental garden. So they're planning on replanting a wild location to aid in plant diversity. Would the strategies that you present here, such as bringing in soil, apply to a situation like that?
I would say if it's a natural area with existing good soils, bringing in soil would be a negative. Really, bringing in soils, we work in such an urban location, and the construction gets done during wet seasons, and there's lots of compaction, and really there isn't. What we deal with a lot of times is subsoil. So we really don't like to encourage bringing in soil unless absolutely last resort necessary. So I would think more of the strategy there would be just making sure you're preparing your soil, making sure that you're taking care of any invasive weeds that are there ahead of time, so you don't have that competition, and making sure that you do the prep work first, rather than just getting it done.
Great. Well, I'm going to piggyback on that and just ask one more little follow-up. Sorry to cut you off if you're going to speak.
That's okay. No,
I'll just throw my little follow-up in there, which is that I feel like I sometimes hear debate on whether or not tilling or rototilling is going to do more harm than good in terms of releasing the invasive beasts in the seed bank. And I realize this is going to be, there's some nuance with region, but I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on that as well.
I'm going to start out by saying, yeah, I agree. I don't really like to till at all in a situation like that. But then if it were a road that just got put in that was scraped and you're dealing with, compacted subsoil, possibly on top of your topsoil, then some significant measures have to be taken. But you really can almost dig down on your soil site, do some soil probing, find out whether you have compaction or not, before you go into those advanced methods of prepping. But most of the time you really don't. Like Joe showed that slide of 5 years of tilling, what it can do to the structure of the soil. So as we get from the urban, really tight urban area to suburban area, that's where those measures come in handy, the tilling, the adding topsoil. Once you get out to the more natural areas, that's the least amount of soil work, is probably the best.
Well, I have to give a nod to my extension colleagues that work very heavily in field crops. And of course, I do soil talks on soils, urban soils, and helping, to mitigate, some of these disasters that we find. But the vast majority of the data comes from field crops. And many of you know this, that for many, many years, there's been a movement towards what, no-till farming. And that's the reason being is because they're trying to limit the disturbance of the soil. And that has been very helpful. On the other hand, and Zach, I want to go back to the idea that it can bring up, well, actually, most of our invasive, I deal a lot with poison hemlock and wild parsnip here in Ohio. And poison hemlock seeds, they only last about 5 to 6 years, even on the surface. Maximum germination, though, actually occurs on the surface. So the buried, reduces germination. That seems counterintuitive for a lot of people. We plant seeds, we say plant seeds, but you bury a lot of the seeds for many of these plants, and that's not the way they evolved. They didn't evolve to be buried, is what I'm saying. They actually evolved to be able to germinate on the surface of the soil. So that's just to answer that, Zach. I don't see that. But if you're going to till, what we showed there is exactly the idea. Have a reason, have a plan. If you don't need to, and I have to say, if all of you on here don't have a soil probe, go online and look at it, get yourself a soil probe. It's the X-ray vision for soil. And I joke that I actually think they should make soil probes with shear pins. So if you put it into the soil and it breaks off at the pin, it's compacted. But truthfully, when you try to jam a soil probe into the soil that's compacted, yeah, you do risk breaking it, and that tells you right away. But if it doesn't, you sink that probe into the soil, pull it out. And I'm sorry I took these things out, but that can really give you a good profile. And like Steve said, if you pull it out and you look and say, wow, this is really good, then you're home free. But the final thing, I would not be doing extension justice if I didn't add a cornerstone of soil management and so forth, and that is a soil test. I mean, I teach it, the soil test is a blood test for the soil. It really is. It's like when you go to your physician, they do a blood test to learn, what's going on. It's the same idea. So no matter what you're doing, and if you're coming into a new location, use that probe. If you go online, for example, and just Google Ohio State University Extension soil test. We don't do soil testing, but you'll see a fact sheet that I co-authored on how to soil test. And it's pretty straightforward. Most of you are probably, yeah, we know how to do that, but do that first. And if there's a requirement for some major change, let's say you find out that phosphorus is highly deficient, rototilling can get the phosphorus deeper into the soil. So have a plan if you're going to rototill. I get choked up when I talk about soil.
I get it. It's a moving topic, and I appreciate your passion.
Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. Well, we're starting to lose some more people.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So, but this has just been a fantastic seminar, and we've gotten already really good feedback on it. And I'll make sure that the recording is posted for those that needed to jump off early. They can catch the end of it, and for those that weren't able to make it at all. For those of you that are still here, this has been such a valuable session. Please share it with your peers so that they can be involved. And with that, I want to say a sincere thank you to Steve and Joe for taking your time to present. This has just been absolutely wonderful. And please stay tuned for the, not stay tuned, but come back for the next installment on August 11th, which is going to be monarch conservation and getting your guests involved in monarch conservation, a topic relevant to all of us out doing natural history interpretation and conservation in a zoo setting. And just another plug as well for the Protecting the Pollinators in the Urban Landscape Conference. Athens is a great town anyway. I don't know if Jason Biggs is going to be there. He had the photo credit there, but man, if he's going to be there, that's worth going just on its own because he's an awesome guy. So thank you so much. And thanks for everybody for joining us. And we'll see you next time.
Hey, Zach, thanks a whole lot.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys.